This year, ORCO is celebrating 75 years spanning 3 generations. I want to introduce ORCO's president, Rick Muth, who will introduce his former teacher and mentor, Dr. James Doti. Rick?
Jim, thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction. And I'd like to also thank everybody for the 30th annual Inland Empire Forecast. We'll hear some very thoughtful insights about our nation, California, and the Inland Empire. We'll have Dr. Ramon Chavira, Director of Anderson Center for Economic Research and Professor of Economics, and Dr. Jim Doti, President Emeritus and Professor of Economics. Now remember, there's a Q&A session at the end of this, and this audience has been great at this. On your screen, you can push a button that says Q&A, and Dave over in the corner here is going to be reading them, and you'll have a very thoughtful conversation afterwards by Dr. Doti and Ramon Chavira. Well, I want to give my personal appreciation for this studio, the Orange County Production Studio. They've been wonderful to work with. All the students have done all the research, and everybody involved with this thing. And Dr. Doti, 30 years ago, I went to you and I said, the Orange County forecast is just done so well. What do you think about doing the Inland Empire forecast? This Inland Empire is growing. Yes, it has. It's grown. And I remain your forever student, your supporter, and your friend. And introducing now our renowned forecaster, supporter who loves teaching, loves Chapman University and helping personal and business decision makers. And I want to mention one other thing. Dr. Doti donated one of his kidneys to a person he'd never met before, and he's happy to talk to you about that. Maybe not so much here, but I bet we could throw a few questions in there. Dr. Doti, it's such a pleasure.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership in making this forecast possible.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, it's amazing, Rick, that it's 30 years ago. 30 years we've been doing this, and I want to thank the Orange County studios here, production studios. Arnie and his team do a great job, and it's a pleasure and privilege to be here in the studio presenting our 30th forecast. And we have a lot of interesting and exciting things in store for you. If by some chance you had an opportunity to watch our forecast or attend the forecast at Chapman University in December, we presented the U.S., California, and Orange County forecasts. Since December, all kinds of things have happened. In addition, we've been doing additional research on the Inland Empire, and we have some updated results for you, not only for the U.S., but some, I think, interesting findings relating to the Inland Empire's economic future. But let me begin by doing something that has become a tradition since I returned to the faculty as a professor. I select the best response on a student evaluation. This is the runner-up, and I think it's a sign of the times. Even though Dr. Doti is old, I'm impressed he knows Excel. Well, this is a good segue into this next slide because there are some good things about growing old. Last year I hit the tender age of 75, but on the day of my 75th birthday, I made a commitment to run a half marathon in Chicago. The reason for that is because all of a sudden, instead of competing against 50 or so men and women runners in the 70 to 74 age bracket, I was able to move in with just 10 or so old codgers like me running the half marathon. Not only was I running with these other geezers, I was the youngest of those geezers. And I'm happy to report that I actually won first place of those 10. So Rick Muth, I know, is a fellow runner with me. There are indeed good things about growing old if you could keep running. If you remember last year at the forecast, the most important variable at the national level that is really like the blood pressure of the nation, the one measure that kind of says it all regarding how the economy is doing, is real gross domestic product. And our forecast last year was included with the 50 blue chip forecasters. I'm going to select here the 10 highest forecasts. Goldman Sachs was most optimistic, forecasting 5.9, but we weren't far off at 5.7%. And this is of 50 different forecasts. Those of you from UCLA wondering where they might be, I believe they were somewhere around 20th in rank. They were forecasting approximately 4% growth. So when you look at what really happened with real GDP, we don't have final figures for the fourth quarter yet. Even the first through third quarters will be revised, but I'm pleased to say that it looks now like our 5.7% forecast will be a bullseye. If not a bullseye, it's going to be very close to it. But I'm actually even more proud of a forecast we had at our update forecast, where we differed from the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board regarding the future of interest rates, and more importantly, the future of inflation. Here's a photo on your screen. You see Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, who back in, this is in June, was saying they will keep interest rates near zero. They weren't looking for interest rate changes until 2023 or even 2024. We differed because we saw inflation. Reason for that is our model is more monetarist in nature, and the greatest monetarist of the 20th century is Milton Friedman, and he said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This was a great acid test back in June. I mentioned this. What happens now from June on will be a great test as to whether the new monetarists who believe that deficits and money supply, they don't matter, the old monetarist, Milton Friedman, who believes that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Well, it turns out that the data suggests that Milton Friedman was correct. Here is where we were up through the first and second quarter of last year. Notice in your graph that the gray line, which is CPI, was holding relatively flat. If you look on the right side, that's the screen. It's about 2% inflation, and this is where Powell was saying, we're not going to increase interest rates. We, however, if you look at the red line, saw that explosion in monetary growth to 25% as ultimately leading to inflation. We didn't see it then. It was about 2%. But we knew, given the lag between money growth and price growth, that inflation was imminent. And indeed it was. Look at that sharp spike upwards that occurred after the first quarter from inflation of around 2%. This shows through the third quarter 5.5%, and as you know, it's now increasing at a rate even more than 6%. Well, who won that battle? Well, I think even Jerome Powell would say Milton Friedman must have won, because here's a quote: "It's time to retire transitory when talking about inflation." So when Jerome Powell early on was saying, this inflation, yeah, it's picking up, but it's transitory, it's going to go away soon. Well, it didn't. It's with us, and it looks like it's going to continue through next year. In fact, here's our forecast. Money growth, we see, will be declining through 2022. The Federal Reserve Board is beginning to reduce its bond and mortgage bond purchases each month from $125 billion by June to zero, and that may even happen sooner than that. But nonetheless, because of the lag between money growth and prices, we see inflation steady in the 6 to 7% range through the rest of the year. That's supported by what we see in producers' prices. Producers' prices lead consumer prices. These are the prices that manufacturing service firms, they're purchasing in the market, and then they produce a completed service or product, and of course, if they're paying more in producers' prices, they will pass those prices down the line to consumers. The president would have you believe this is a supply side problem caused by cartels, monopolies. In this case, this particular article from Epoch Times is about Biden complaining about energy costs. Well, we could see what he's complaining about. Over 2020 to 2021, and this is something you well understand when you go to the gas station, prices over the course of a year, 2 years, have increased 61%. Huge, huge increase. So you can see why Biden is complaining about this, blaming it on cartels. But look at those dates. This is from November of 2020 to November of 21. If you were to take a longer time horizon, go back to the third quarter of 18, before this recent hike of 60+%, oil prices were dropping like a lead balloon. So if you take the longer period, as shown here from 18 third quarter to 21 third quarter, gas prices dropped and then increased 60%, but over the entire time period, gas prices have increased as much as the CPI. Now, if Biden is correct that this big increase in prices is caused by these oil firms, these cartels, and making these agreements among themselves to foist these higher prices on the public, why were they so bad at allowing prices to decrease? In fact, the reason for the big decrease and big increase is that gas prices are very volatile. At any point in time, there's only so much refined petroleum, gasoline out there. And when demand changes, it has an exaggerated impact on prices. We also have Senator Warren getting in on the action. In this case, she's blaming not the cartel oil firms, but the cartel price fixing poultry sector in terms of what happened to turkey prices. She came up with this back in October and November when turkey prices were increasing. As you can see in this graph, you see the CPI. Look at turkey prices. If you look on the left-hand side of that graph, they were increasing close to 20% from last year. 20% year-to-year increase when overall inflation was around, 6%. So why are turkey prices increasing so rapidly? Senator Warren would have you believe the cartel. Only a few producers, and they're foisting these higher prices onto the public. This is another little-known fact that you may not know, relates to my background, and that is that I have a couple chickens in the backyard, so I consider myself a chicken farmer. I'm not a member, sadly, of any cartel. Nobody has ever hired me or asked me to attend cartel meetings. Actually, I'd love to do it, see what goes on behind closed doors. But being a chicken farmer, I know something that has happened, and that is I'm paying more for my chicken feed. Chicken feed isn't chicken feed anymore. In fact, feed prices have increased on an annual basis in 21 almost 40%, 35% or so. Big, big increase. Obviously, poultry producers paying more for feed, principal cost, pass that on to the public. So it's not a cartel. It's not a supply side problem as much as it is demand. Where's that demand coming from? Senator Warren and President Biden, they don't need to look very far. It's coming from the federal government. There have been so much fiscal stimulus in the economy, various acts, various kinds of legislation. We forget how many spending packages have been approved by government over the last couple of years. Here they are, the big ones. Federal legislation, these are all the acts, CARES Act. This doesn't even include Build Back Better. But if you add all of these up, that's $10 trillion of fiscal stimulus. We've never, in the history of the U.S., ever had anything like that. That resulted, if you look at 19 and 20 in this graph, the deficit each year in excess of $3 trillion, cumulatively about $6.5 trillion over a 2-year period. That means the federal government is spending more than it's taking in, and as a result, it's creating demand stimulus, which if the economy isn't able to respond with production, prices go up. That stimulus, by the way, hasn't all been spent. It will continue, even if Build Back Better is never passed, doesn't look like it will, the lagged effects of the stimulus will continue through 2022, buttressing and keeping spending very, very strong. Evidence of that, I looked at the personal savings rate in the U.S. I noticed these spikes on April 20th, January 21, and March 21. What the heck caused these spikes in savings? And I found out that those when stimulus checks were sent out. So some of the stimulus money has not been spent, that's been saved, which means that it's dry powder for spending in 2022 this year. When you couple that with what's happening in household net worth, higher home values, a stronger stock market, household net worth, as you can see, has increased to $145 trillion. In the fourth quarter, we don't have those numbers in yet, but we believe current data we have on house prices in the stock market suggests it could very easily hit $160 trillion. That kind of net worth is what economists call a wealth effect, that kind of wealth leads to more spending. And that's why we believe, and our forecast for 2022 is 4.4. Now remember, last year, 2021, we forecasted 5.7. We think that's going to be a bullseye. We'll find out. If not a bullseye, it's going to be very close. Remember the 4.4 for next year because we'll see how well we did, not only Chapman, but compared to the other blue chip forecasters. Interest rates, federal funds rate, we think 1% by the end of the year. 10-year T-bond, which has already increased about from 1.6 there in the fourth quarter, 1.8. We think 2.5 by the end of the year. 30-year mortgage rate, 3 to almost 4%. They're already at 3.5%. Big increase since December. I'm going to conclude the U.S. forecast with some thoughts I have about the possibility of a recession in the future. Obviously, there's going to be a recession sometime, but we really believe that current trends suggest it may be sooner than you think. This is a graph of the federal funds rate and real gross domestic product. Every time the Federal Reserve Board has increased interest rates, here you can see it in around 1987, it led to a sharp drop in real GDP. And a recession, by the way. Another increase, the second one here, around 2000. Notice the drop in real GDP. That also led to a recession. Here's another drop in real GDP and another recession. The fact of the matter is, whenever the Federal Reserve Board begins a process of monetary tightening with the intent of increasing the federal funds rate to bring down inflation, it invariably leads to recession. Let me make that very clear. Always, the Federal Reserve Board has never been able to begin tightening without leading to recession. I'll explain why in just a few moments. There's one other very negative factor that will not affect the economy so much this year, 2022, as much as it is 2023. Remember I said there's still dry powder from previous fiscal actions that will help the economy and lead to 4.4% growth per our forecast for real GDP. That's virtually double the rate of normal growth in real GDP. But in the longer run, the sharp drop in the deficit, there still will be a deficit, a big deficit of $1 trillion, but that's a drop from around $3 trillion that we've had over the last 2 years. $3 trillion to $1 trillion is a $2 trillion decrease. That's 10% of real gross domestic product. Obviously going to have effects. So we have a double whammy. We have a more contractionary monetary policy, less monetary growth, having a long-run impact, and very contractionary fiscal policy, also having a long impact that we believe might hit as early as 2023. Why does the Federal Reserve always overdo it? Why does these Fed increases invariably lead to recession? The reason for it is because the Fed is not really paying attention to real GDP. It's trying to bring inflation down. The problem is, to bring inflation down, you have to bring GDP down. You have to reduce demand. And you can see this in these graphs, which show a comparison of the federal funds rate, discount rate, that's what the Federal Reserve Board is increasing now, GDP, and also we have inflation here measured. It took 7 quarters of dropping GDP growth before inflation finally decreased. Same thing happened in the 80s. Same thing happened in the late 90s, early 2000, where you have a decrease, an increase in the federal funds rate. It brings about a decrease in GDP. Inflation, nothing happens. But eventually, if you bring GDP down enough, it will finally break the back of inflation and do what the Federal Reserve was trying to do all the time, and that is squeeze out inflation through a more contractionary monetary policy. The problem is, in doing that, it brings down GDP. One question might be, why is the Fed even fighting inflation? Well, here's a great example. Nominal wage rates have increased, gangbuster growth of almost 5% over the October 20 to October 21, an annual increase of 5%. That's the highest increase we've had in many, many years. But if you take those nominal wages and adjust for inflation, it actually turns out that real wages have decreased almost 2%. That's the problem with inflation. It eventually eats into the earning capacity of the public, in addition to causing high prices in our economy. Well, that brings us to, I think, some significant findings that we uncovered at the Anderson Center for Economic Research relating to a more micro look at what's going on in the job market. We know that jobs simply haven't come back strongly, that many, many more people have decided to stay home and not re-enter the workforce. That's the macro conclusion. But we've been doing more micro analysis, and the person heading that up is the director of our Center for Economic Research, Ramon Sphere. He has some very interesting findings to share with you. Ramon? That's the slide.
Thank you, Jim. I would like to thank Rick Muth for giving Jim and me the opportunity to make this presentation to you. As you well know, COVID-19 has disrupted the economy as well as the labor market. What I would like to show you is what has been the impact on the labor force and employment. Let's define what the labor force is first. The labor force is the number of people who are employed and those who are unemployed but looking for a job. If someone would like to have a job but is not looking for one, they would not be included in the labor force. What you see in front of you is the change between every month since February 2020 and the month of February 2020. Why are we comparing to February 2020? That's because that was the month before the onset of the COVID-19 recession. The line in green is for men and the line in red is for women. The reason I split the two is to see whether there is any difference between going back into labor force between men and women. If you look on October 2021, you can see that there are around fewer employees that are male compared to February 2020, around 900,000. But for women, the number is 1.3 million people. That's the number of those who are in the labor force below what we used to have in February 2020. So the labor force has been impacted much more by women rather than by men. How about the labor force participation rate? It is the ratio of the labor force by the number of people who are 16 years and older. Again, you can see that the line in green is closer to 0 than it is for women. That is, the labor force participation rate has recuperated for men much more than the labor force participation rate for women. How about on the employment side? This graph is for those age group 20 to 34. You can see that there are fewer than 100,000 men employed today compared to February 2020. But there are close to 500,000 women employed today, less than in February 2020. So here again, compared to the labor force, the impact has been on women much more than what it has been on men. How about the age group 35 to 54? Same story. There are fewer than 100,000 men employed today compared to February 2020, while there are around 500,000 women less employed today compared to February 2020. Now, there are some who say that it is also the senior citizens who have not come back to the labor force and who are unemployed. That's only partly true. This is a slide for the age group of 65 and over. You can see that the green line is at the 0 line. That is, the number of people who are 65 and older. For men, that number is the same as it used to be in February 2020. But for women, the number is 250,000 less than what it was in 2020. So to say that for all groups that are senior citizens that did not come back to the labor force is not really true. Now, why is it that the impact has been more on women than on men? The Bureau of Labor Statistics has reported that a larger percent of women compared to men said that the reason they have not joined the labor force is because of COVID-19. That is, the impact on women is more than on men because they are the ones who took that impact when it came to childcare, when it came to the quarantine of the children, or if one or more of the children really caught the disease. So actually, we should be thankful for women for taking the brunt of the impact. Another reason is the following. There are more women than men in the education and healthcare sector and in the leisure and hospitality sector. And these sectors did not recuperate as much as the rest of the sectors. So because there are more women in these two sectors and employment did not recuperate fast enough between February 2020 and now, that explains in part why more women than men are still unemployed. The number of re-entrants into the labor force has declined from September to October and again from October to November. There are two types of people who enter the labor force. There are those who were employed before, and we call them re-entrants, and there are new entrants. Unfortunately, of those who were working before, more women than men have not re-entered the labor force. Now, as far as the labor force participation rate, before the onset of the recession, it hovered at around 63.3%. But today, it is around 61.9%. That's a difference of 1.4 percentage points. Now, one might say that this is not a very large percentage, But knowing that the labor force is 162 million people, that comes out to be around 2.3 or 2.4 million people. That is, fewer people are now in the labor force by around 2.3 million. If those rejoin the labor force, the number of employed would increase substantially. So not only the labor force did not increase in the last 2 years, but it actually has gone down by around 2.3 or 2.4 million people. Until we take actions to really convince people to go back and rejoin the labor force, and people become more comfortable going back to their older jobs, we are going to continue to have a negative impact on employment. And many companies are going to continue to have difficulty attracting workers to their job openings. As you know, there are around 10.5 million jobs that are available right now. Many of those are going to continue to be unfilled because of the discomfort for many people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, who are not comfortable going back to the labor force. Thank you very much for listening. And here's Jim back to present the California forecast and the Inland Empire forecast.
Thank you, Ramon. Interesting stuff. Well, we're now at a point where we're moving to California and then the Inland Empire. The nice thing for us here in this beautiful studio is that rather than a typical Zoom call where we're sitting somewhere, we can walk around and be comfortable. So you may want to get up and take a stretch and get your blood flowing. And those of you who may be worried still about that recession call I gave a few minutes ago, you may want to get a stiff bourbon or something for the rest of the day. Well, let's get into California because some interesting things. Actually, good news. I've got some good news here for California. You can see it here. This shows you the brunt of the recession in 2020. In California, we were losing 7.4% of our labor force. Then we came back a bit in 21, and in 22 we see an increase of 4.2%. That compares to an increase of around 3.5% that we're forecasting for the U.S. So California will outperform the U.S., we're forecasting this year. Why? I'd like to say it's other reasons, but it relates to COVID. First of all, if you take the U.S. average, and let's look at it now from September 19, just before COVID hit and the recession hit, to 20, that's the brunt of the COVID period, to the recovery period from September 20 to 21. So both periods are 1 year in length. Notice that during the early COVID period, the U.S. lost about 6.6%. That's in green. And then California, during the same period, lost 9.2%. So we suffered far more than the U.S. The recovery period, the U.S. is coming back 3.4%, but California is coming back more strongly with 5.5%. This is the forecast I just presented, where I noted that California this year will grow faster than the U.S. Why? Relates to stringency and control of COVID, as it's not a surprise to anyone that California has been more stringent in terms of regulations, things like distance wearing, mask wearing, closing schools, closing bars, restaurants, recreational facilities, and so on. And as a result of that, during the worst of COVID, obviously California suffered more because the economy was squeezed more than other states. We looked at all 50 states in terms of their stringency, and there's a score. Oxford University puts out, it's a daily score. We looked at the 10 most stringent states, of which California is one during this period, and those states lost 9.1%. The least stringent states, all the way on the other side of the spectrum, they lost about 4.9%. When you lose more, like California, and lessen those restrictions or remove those restrictions, the recovery will be greater because there are idle resources that now are going back and rejoining the labor force. Least stringent states, obviously there's a recovery, but there aren't as many idle resources to be reemployed, so the growth rate will be lower. So that explains why we believe California will be coming back more strongly. And there's another factor, and it relates to stringency. Here's a measure of this daily Oxford stringency score going all the way back to January of 21. This is like a year into COVID. Notice California's stringency score about 62 compared to the US's 52 or so, actually 48. So the difference was about 15 points. California's stringency score was 15 points higher. That's narrowed, especially through August. It's widened a little bit since then. But even now, two things have happened. First of all, stringency for both the US in general, other states in California, they all declined. But California declined even more. And in spite of the recent surge, Omicron surge, it has stayed relatively flat. So this is probably a good sign that the recovery will continue and will not be muted by a return of more stringency. And that gets to this next very important topic, and that is, well, what about Omicron? Are things going to tighten up again? And this forecast, this very optimistic forecast of 4.4% GDP in the US and stronger growth in California than the US. Maybe COVID's going to come back and result in greater stringency in the future, which will throw off the forecast. What I'm going to present to you now is the most current data we have on COVID. This goes through January 18th, and I think it suggests that this is a strong statement given the changes that have taken place in this cycle of COVID, but it looks like Omicron is peaking and that the coronavirus and the pandemic is peaking as well. First of all, this doesn't look like a softening of it. These are cases, COVID cases, and you can see January 2022. You see that huge spike to 800,000 cases. That's a 7-day moving average, so it's not cyclical. This is 7 days. The average hit 800,000 at a peak here in January. That's like 3 times higher than the previous peak very early this year or late last year in January of 2021. So this looks like an explosion of cases, and it has been. But let's look at deaths. This is the death rate. Now you have to look at the right side of the graph to see the death count because they're vastly different. And you can see here how the cycles of cases happen before deaths. We have found at Chapman, our research, by the way, we're doing quite a bit of COVID research, probably more economic research than any other university in California. 3 of our research efforts have been published, 1 in the Journal of Bioeconomics, 1 in COVID economics, and 1 in the Social Science Research Network. So we're doing a lot of research in this area, and we have found that cases lead deaths by 21 days. In other words, if you get the disease, the COVID, on average, a death will occur 20 days later. So if we take into account that lead cases and you lag cases by 20 days, you can see that the lead, notice the big increase in cases, that's in green, that happened early in 2021. Look at that sharp increase in deaths. Deaths of roughly 3,500 per day in the US 7-day moving average. And a similar kind of thing happened with the Delta surge in September and October. There, the increase was maybe to 2,000 deaths and cases relatively lower. Since then, cases have exploded, unlike anything we've had throughout the pandemic. But notice that deaths have not increased all that much. It's been cyclical. It's held steady within a narrow band of 1,500 to 2,000 deaths per day. That's not insignificant, obviously. There are tragedies behind every one of those stories. But if the traditional relationship between cases and deaths held up, it would be a disaster. That hasn't happened because the percentage of deaths to cases lag 20 days has dropped sharply. Just since November 1, the death rate was 2.13%. That means, on average, if you had a COVID back in November, it would have been the Delta variety, most likely. There would have been a 2.15% of dying maybe 20 days later or so. Now that has decreased to 0.52%, mainly as a result of the Omicron surge. Cases have exploded, but deaths have held about the same, and that has brought the death rate down. One other thing, look at those low points, all the way from June of 20 to the current period. Notice how each of the low points keeps getting lower and lower and lower, suggesting that the pandemic is moderating over time. If current trends persist, that is, over the next 3 weeks, given the cases we already have, if deaths stay in that 1,500 to 2,000, or even increase to 2,500 as a result of the explosion of cases, that death rate will go down to 0.25%, which means 1 of every 400 people are dying. And if it's 0.25%, that compares to a common flu death rate of 0.1 to 0.15%. They're beginning to converge, suggesting that hopefully the worst of this is over. There's one other final thing that suggests that even this Omicron surge is peaking in cases. Not only are deaths not responding to these cases, but now over the last week or so, most recent data, it looks like cases may have peaked. It's very early, but it looks like they have come down for the first time, the first drop since December 1, when the first Omicron cases were reported in the US. All of this is to say that the current findings suggest that the coronavirus, the pandemic, will not lead to a new stringency, new tightening that will change our forecast of an optimistic increase in GDP at the national level and job growth in California this next year. Crisis at the ports, I'll be talking a little bit more about this when we get into the Inland Empire forecast. Just to give you an idea of this so-called crisis, it is a crisis. All those backed up ships leading to all kinds of supply chain problems and delays in getting goods to market. But there's been an explosion of trade that has had an enormous positive impact in California in generating jobs relating to distributing these goods, these imported goods to market. Look at LA, Long Beach, 2 largest ports in the US. This shows in 2021, imports increased 13%. Where is that 13% increase coming from? Where are we importing these goods? Here, from 1 to 10, are the top 10 nations. Number 1, China, Mexico, Canada, and so on. I'm going to show you here, these are the countries, Pacific Rim, whose goods are, the majority, coming in through those LA and Long Beach ports. Just those countries alone of the top 10, and you're talking about 6 of them, comprise around $750 billion. And if you just look at China alone, see that $360 billion? This compares 2020 to 2021. Notice that total, 20%, almost a 20% increase in imports from China. And obviously, you know, without investment, infrastructure investment in the ports, in the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, rail, trucking, and so on, you're going to have backups. And that is what has happened. But nonetheless, that's led to a job increase in those sectors. And we're going to get into that when we get into the Inland Empire. Okay, overall payroll employment, California, the peak pre-COVID in terms of employment was 17.7 million people in payroll employment. Total population of California is around 40 million. There you see the COVID drop, the COVID recession, which occurred really over a 2-month period in early 2020, the shortest recession in the history of the U.S. Been the recovery since then. But even if you believe our forecast, if our forecast pans out, we see by year end 17.4 million, which means we are still, even at the end of this year, all the way through December, we still will not have recovered all of the jobs lost. That in part explains why California's unemployment rate is as high as it is. This goes through November. You may know that the most recent unemployment figure, which came out just 2 days ago, it hit 3.9%. So it's continuing to drop, but California continues to be, roughly 2.5% higher. Not only is that because COVID is still more restrictive, there's a lagged effect because of its greater stringency in its COVID regulations, but I believe there's a longer run problem that relates to the fact that we're losing businesses, we're losing population. We just did a survey. Chapman partnered, it's called the Chapman UCI UCSD, University of California, San Diego survey. We're still tabulating the results, so I don't have them here for you. But in general, we're finding that many, many more businesses are thinking of leaving the state, and the answers that they're giving us, there are quite a few, but most of them relate to regulation and taxation in California, and the intent of these firms leaving or intending to leave in the future to escape that regulatory burden and tax burden. Okay, well, that brings us to the Inland Empire forecast and some very interesting findings. Some good. I think the audience out here from the Inland Empire, I think you're used to seeing a lot of good news, a lot of growth. Unlike most of California, Inland Empire, in particular Riverside County versus San Bernardino, is still growing population-wise, and I'll get into that. So you've been used to a lot of good news, but I'm going to share some unsettling news that has not been reported. It's a result of recent research that we've been working on, even since last December, that we're going to report here. Important implications regarding strategy for the future of Inland Empire, and what kinds of things our community, the leadership in the community, in government, in business, in education, needs to be focused on in making sure the Inland Empire, in terms of its economy, continues growing. First of all, the good news. This shows you payroll employment and year-to-year job changes each quarter from the pre-COVID period of last part of 19, the fourth quarter of 2019. Notice the Inland Empire was growing around 4% versus 2% in California. Then the recession hit. But still, Inland Empire was hit. There was negative growth, but not as much as California. Then the recovery, and notice since the recovery, California and the Inland Empire have been growing about the same rate, and those dotted lines, that's our forecast. Basically, we see the Inland Empire growing about as rapidly as California. That ain't bad, considering the fact that we already are forecasting that California will do better than the U.S., and we believe the Inland Empire will follow with that average growth greater than the U.S. This gives you another example, more data that relates to why the Inland Empire is doing better, or a measure as to how much better it's doing. This shows that over the 2019 Q4 period, that's just before the recession hit, before COVID hit, to the most recent data we have on jobs, 2021 Q3. This is the average change, the cumulative change from 2019 Q4 to the most current data. And it shows that on average, California lost about 7.6% of its jobs over that year and a half period. Notice that LA lost about 8.5%, San Francisco even more, 8.9%. But look at Inland Empire, minus 4.5%. About half of the job loss of LA and San Francisco. Orange County did a little better than average, but the best performing region in the state for a larger county of the 55 or so counties has been the Inland Empire. So in many respects, the Inland Empire has been a job machine. And even during the recession, while it lost employment, relative to other areas, outperformed. Why? What is the major factor leading to that stronger growth? Well, if you take total payroll employment, which is comprised of maybe 12 major job sectors, and compare that to transportation and warehousing, this is going all the way back to 2017. Just look at 17. Transportation and warehousing grew at double-digit rates of almost 15% versus maybe 4% overall. Look at in 2020. 2020, that was the year of the recession. That was the year of COVID, when COVID had its most significant hit. Transportation and warehousing was continuing to grow during the recession. It went above 15%, whereas total payroll employment, as you can see here, in the Inland Empire dropped about 5%. US had dropped even more, California more. Part of the reason Inland Empire did so much better than other regions is because of the strong growth in transportation and warehousing. Even though we see that differential in growth moderating, that is converging, if you will, through 2022, we still see a difference of almost 5%. That's huge in terms of greater growth in transportation and warehousing. So that's where the action is in the Inland Empire. Let's get into that a little more micro. Let's take our microscopes and see what's going on here. Now we're looking at just the Inland Empire, warehousing and storage jobs, not just transportation and warehousing. This is more specific. Look at this explosion in growth in jobs. 115,000, I mean, huge. That's a huge percentage of overall growth of the economy. Here are some of the reasons. Asian manufacturing over the last 20 years has increased enormously. The Pacific Rim, trade with China. We also have an expansion of the ports, LA and Long Beach. You saw those data before, numbers 1, number 2 in terms of the volume of trade going through those ports. LA gentrification, LA becoming more of a high-tech area. Many of the manufacturing facilities going out of business or relocating more likely. But also some areas have changed from warehousing to residential. Gentrification, higher income people moving in closer to the downtown area. But as LA, and to a certain extent Orange County, is moving away from that kind of activity, the Inland Empire is picking it up. Inland Empire has the room, the capacity to grow. Ontario Airport, and you have linkages. San Pedro Bay, only 60 miles away. And COVID-19 has led to more trade. I pointed that already, that huge trade increase of 13%, and most of it, as I pointed out, from the Pacific Rim, going through these ports. How do you distribute these goods if LA is beginning to move away from transportation and particularly warehousing and investing in infrastructure? Orange County as well. The next best thing is the Inland Empire. And the Inland Empire is responding, and responding in a big, big way. The logistics footprint, you have something like 600 million square feet. That's doubled between 2004 and 2020. Doubling, 100% increase. You have big box distribution centers that have relocated to the Inland Empire. And over the 19 to 21, just a 2-year period, 100 of the biggest logistic leases in the county have been signed. And many of you know about the World Logistics Center in Moreno Valley. That's not even in the San Bernardino Riverside region, but it's part of the Inland Empire. And you see 40.5 million square feet in this logistic space of almost 3,000 acres. That's leading to huge dollar investments, $3 billion, and construction over a 15-year period. So there's no question that the Inland Empire is going to be a superstar in terms of facilitating trade with those nations where most of those imports are coming from Pacific Rim. But now, the negative side of it. Chapman and UCI, it's called the Chapman UCI Innovation Index, we track 50 different innovation hubs for jobs in high-tech, mainly high-tech areas, highest paying jobs. These are jobs paying roughly double a county average. This is where the action is. This is where graduates of the engineering schools at UCR and UCI and Chapman, these are the jobs where those graduates are employed. And we're able to look at all 50 of these hubs, and we have an index score based on the number of establishments, the number of jobs, and the salaries paid. And based on a rather complex weighting, we've created this Chapman UCI index, and we track that index every quarter since 2005. So we have quarterly data from 2005 to the current period. It's the most comprehensive source of innovation data in the nation. Well, when you rank those 50 hubs, turns out that Riverside San Bernardino is dead last, 50th, with a score of 0.0577, the lowest by far. So Riverside, San Bernardino, Inland Empire generated a lot of jobs, but not in the highest value added jobs. This is also revealed in something Ramon and I just worked on within the last couple of weeks. We were able to take the most recent real gross product figures on a county-wide basis, and we took it per employee. Nobody has done this before. And you can see since 2011 to 2019, when you take product per employee in Orange County, been relatively flat. Since 15 or so, it's increased a little bit, but it stayed around $140,000 created in product per employee. This would be like taking real gross domestic product and dividing it by the 330 million people living in the US to see on average how much each worker is producing in terms of product, services, and goods that are produced. Notice Riverside and San Bernardino go to 11, significantly lower than Orange County, but more importantly, over the last 10 years, Riverside and San Bernardino declined. Orange County has increased a bit, so that means that it's gone from a differential of something like 20,000 to more like 30,000, 35,000. So, as much as Riverside is growing more rapidly than Orange County, that growth is in lower value-added jobs in warehousing and transportation. There's just an approximation of 20 grand difference versus 40 grand difference most recently. On the construction side, a lot of people moving in. If job growth is strong, permits are strong, it was a 14% increase, huge increase, record levels in 21, and 22 it's going to go even higher. Slightly lower growth. A lot of that slower growth is because of supply side challenges and restraints. Nonetheless, still growth to a highest level of 16.2 thousand rental and single family condominium units being produced in the Inland Empire next year. Housing appreciation, we see a big drop, 21.5, gangbuster appreciation in 21, declining to 5.9%. But that 5.9%, if you look at it on a quarterly basis, is actually showing a steady decline to that 5% figure. Why do we see this big drop in housing prices? Well, there are a number of reasons. But the most important reason is that if you believe our forecast of mortgage rates increasing, and they are already, when we issued our forecast for mortgage rates of going from basically 3 to 4% this year, they've already increased to 3.5. We're already halfway there. So it gives us additional confidence that we're going to reach that higher mortgage rate. Much of the increase that we've had from 2017 to the most current figure, this is showing you housing prices on average in the Inland Empire, increasing while mortgage rates drop from 4.8 to 2.9. Do you know what that means in terms of payments? Going from 4.8 to 2.9, the 200 basis point swing, that's huge in terms of reducing monthly payments. Well, that means that as you reduce your monthly payments because P&I is lower, you can or because interest rates are lower, you can replace it in terms of higher prices. You could pay more for a home, and your payments will stay the same, or even possibly drop as a result of this very sharp drop in mortgage rates. We're forecasting those are going to go back up from 2.9 to almost 4% year end, and that's why we see housing appreciation dropping from a high of almost in the second quarter of 21 this last year, 30%, almost 30%, to about 5% year end this year. In Orange County, California, it's actually negative by year end. So we see depreciation negative by year end, whereas Inland Empire will ride out the curve with lower appreciation, but still positive. Something interesting here. This is recent research that we've done. We looked at 81 different county areas in the nation, and we ranked them from highest to lowest in price. Of the 5 highest home prices of those 80 counties, 4 of them are in California, with San Francisco being the highest at $1.5 million. I'm also showing you on the right side the lowest price, Toledo being the lowest price, $136,000 median price home, followed by Detroit. Now you're asking, this is an Inland Empire forecast, where is San Bernardino and Riverside? Riverside ranks number 8 at 530, and San Bernardino ranks 10th at 469. So as affordable as we in California perceive the Inland Empire, on a national basis, it's not all that affordable. It still ranks in the 8th and 10th of 80 different counties. I'm going to show you now something that will be published, I think, next week in the Orange County Business Journal, an analysis that we did on what explains why prices in California are so much higher than these other areas. Well, this is a summary of our findings, these 81 counties. We have found, on average, when median household income increases by $10,000 in a county, that leads to a home price increase of $121,000. We also found amenities. There is a score put out by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as to the quality of life in a particular area. They measure things like climate, geographic features, proximity to water, a mild winter, a mild summer, there are approximately 10 different measures that are weighted, and then it results in a score that ranges between -2 to +12. And we found that every time there's an increase by a county of one position, going from, let's say, -2 to -1, or 5 to 6, that results in a price increase of $22,000. Okay, now let's take Orange County, which is 926,000, and San Bernardino at 469,000. That's a difference of $457,000. Big, big difference. What explains that? Is there anything rational in our free market system to justify this kind of a difference? Well, in Orange County, our median family income is $95,000 or almost 96 compared to 67,000 in San Bernardino. That results in a difference. Given those ratios I gave you before, that results in $338,000 difference right there because of the difference in income. Amenities, the amenity score in Orange County is 8.74 in San Bernardino County, probably because the heat in the summer and maybe the cold in the winter, 3.95. That results in a difference of 111. You add those two predicted differences, that explains like $450,000 almost of the difference. The actual difference is 457. I can take any two counties. I could take Orange County and Detroit and explain that huge difference. Or explain why Orange Counties is so much lower than San Jose or San Francisco. Results in income and amenities. Net domestic migration, I'm going to conclude the Inland Empire forecast with some demographic data. We can see here that LA over the two-year period from 2018 to 2020 went from a loss of 2.8%, that's huge in population, just over a two-year period, to an increase in Riverside of 1% and close to zero, only minus 0.5% in San Bernardino. As I pointed out before, at the beginning of the Inland Empire forecast, the Inland Empire is one of the few, it is in fact the only large county in California that is still growing in population. Here you can see Inland Empire, which is given in yellow. Notice that since 11, when it was below the U.S., certainly above, it was below Orange County, roughly about the same as the U.S. Since 2016, Orange County population, the percentage rate of growth has dropped to negative. Actual loss in Orange County in 2020, whereas the Inland Empire now is significantly above both the U.S. and certainly way over Orange County. Well, that leads us to the best response on a student evaluation. I got this from an econometric student. And I need to explain to you, this is something you may not be aware of, but young people, the nice thing about teaching is you can see what are some of the cultural things that are going on with young people. Turns out that they're watching, in addition to playing video games, and at Chapman studying hard in business, in addition to all of that, they're watching Korean television. They're streaming it on different channels. So like the Squid Games, which have become, you know, a skyrocketing success in terms of ratings. So with that as a backdrop, this was the best response on a student evaluation. Your class reminds me of streaming Korean series on Netflix. Like your lectures, they never seem to end. Well, you may be feeling the same way right now, but we are ending. But before I end, I want to acknowledge my friend, my colleague, and I'm very proud to say my former student, Rick Muth, given the fact that he'd become a leader of the Inland Empire, but also the Orange County community as well. And to know that way, way back, 30 years ago, when he came to me with the idea of doing an Inland Empire, that we'd be here 30 years later. So, Rick, thank you for your vision, for making this possible, and your persistence and your help and your support that's made this forecast possible. I also want to thank the BIA. It's been great to do this in partnership with them, but also thank these Orange County production studios. It's a joy doing this presentation here with these incredible facilities. And with that, I think we have a good amount of time for for Q&A. Dave, I hope you've been getting some good questions, and we can use the rest of the time. We love the Q&A. In fact, Rick Muth was the first one to really push us to do a Q&A, and I've given a lot of presentations, as Ramon has as well, and for some reason, you guys asked some very perceptive, interesting questions, and we'll do now the best job we can in responding. So, Ramon, would you join me on the stage here so I can give all the tough questions to you? Well, welcome back. Here we are. Here's Ramon, and here I am. And Dave, you have some interesting questions for us?
Sure do.
Okay, well, great. This is a screen. I don't have to struggle trying to hear what the question may be. If population and businesses are leaving the state, how will that affect our Inland Empire and Orange County residential development? Well, that's a great question. It's not going to help. It's going to reduce development. When you have people, and the reason people are leaving because jobs are leaving, businesses are leaving, and that means you don't need as much manufacturing, you don't need as much commercial space, and you don't even need as many homes. So the number of homes we're producing each year will not have to be as significant as we've had. For example, in California, we've been producing about 110,000 homes on average per year over the last 5 years or so. So let's take 100,000. But that's based on positive population growth. The delayed or the lagged effect of reduced population growth will certainly bring down demand and, as a result, construction. On the commercial side, Riverside is still going to be doing great in terms of industrial space, warehousing, but when you look at AAA office space with people now, not only population, this is going beyond population growth, people now working virtually, that will reduce demand. You're not seeing that in the data yet, but those people who own commercial properties are giving away a lot of freebies, and eventually we're going to see lower lease costs. So it will have a negative impact, which means that if you don't want that kind of long-term impact on our state, lose those construction jobs, lose that kind of vitality in an economy, we have to go to the root source of the problem to lose a fewer number of people or even go back to where we were in the past, and that is adding population rather than losing population. And the data we have suggests we have to look in terms of our taxation. We're now, in the ranking of 50 states, we are now number 2 behind New Jersey, just ahead of New York. And in terms of regulation, on 2 different measures of regulation, California is the most regulated state. That's expensive. In an increasingly competitive global economy, businesses can't survive with that kind of a burden of cost, either on the tax or regulatory side, and that's leading to this out-migration. Anything to add to that?
There's one good side is that in the short term, the impact on Riverside in particular will not be as bad as for California because the population is still growing. While the population in California went down a little bit in the last year, that of Riverside has increased. So the impact will not be as negative as for the rest of California.
And as for Governor Newsom's call that we need 500,000 units a year, that is completely bogus. Not only are we not going to go anywhere near there, we're going to be hard-pressed to maintain the kind of volume we've had in residential development over the last 5 years. Well, the next question. It appears that President Trump's tax plan is still in. Do you expect to see major tax changes in 2022? I don't. I know there was a lot of talk about capital gains and eliminating the step up in basis when a person or a family unit passes away, so they don't have to pay the capital gain. Their heirs don't have to pay. There was talk about removing that. I still think that that's probably somewhere down the line in our future, but not 2022. By the way, you're going to have to, the update forecast, we're working on a model now that hopefully, and it's not ready for prime time, but it's a model that predicts the results of the mid-year election in the House of Representatives. That is, typically there's a swing to the party not held by the president, and we're going to hopefully come up with a more accurate forecast, but we'll probably be releasing that in June. I bring that up now simply because with the Senate so evenly divided and the president not having the congressional authority of a sitting president with his party, I don't see any major changes this year.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the Build Back Better plan of President Biden does not seem to really to go on because of opposition by the Republicans and a couple of Democrats in the Senate. And as a result, there is no reason to change to increase taxes, whether corporate or otherwise, because those increases were meant to pay for that plan. There are discussions now about taking bits and pieces of the plan and approving them one at a time, smaller pieces. So those would not really mean that we need to increase taxes by anything substantial in order to pay for them.
Right. The next question is, how will the economy handle the Fed rate hikes? It depends on what those hikes are going to be. But if you believe our forecast that there will be maybe 3 hikes this year, and we at this point think at a minimum it'll move it from essentially 0 to 1%. So you have a 100 basis point swing. The question isn't so much how they will handle the Fed rate hikes, but what will happen as a result of the impact of Fed rate hikes on other interest rates, like, for example, mortgage rates. If mortgage rates increase maybe 100 basis points, that will have an impact on home prices, will reduce construction, and as we're forecasting, actually outright housing price depreciation by year end, at least in Orange County, maybe not the Inland Empire. But forget those double-digit increases we've had for the last couple of years of 20, 30% appreciation rates during particular quarters. We see that single-digit at best, and by the end of the year, lower prices. So the impact that higher interest rates will have on things like the federal funds rate and treasury bill rates, treasury bond rates, and the impact on the market will be enormous. And I can't help but think that some of the speculation going on and the erratic nature of the market just this last week is in response to the fact that as long-term interest rates increase, we're forecasting the 10-year rate to go up from 1.5% to 2.5%. It's a huge increase in 1 year, 100 basis points long-term rates. That will bring bond rates closer to the earnings price ratio in the stock market. And if, as a result of a slower economy, profits begin to recede a bit and get closer, that's going to lead to, I think, a possible correction in the market. So in response to this question, obviously, these interest rates brought about now by Fed tightening will be significant.
As Jim said, the eventual increase in the federal funds rate is going to impact other interest rates. But we have already seen that the 10-year Treasury bond rate is higher than what it was at the end of last year. And the mortgage rate is already at 3.5% compared to the end of last year. So the markets already have taken into consideration the potential increases in the federal funds rate.
Next question is, what can be done to improve the lack of skilled labor in construction? That's a great question, and I know that's a major problem throughout the nation, but in particular in California. And I just can't help but think that because of the lack of skilled labor in the free market system, those wage rates are going to be increasing. That increase in wage rates will over time lead to, I think, an increase in the participation rate and the number of construction workers. And to get those jobs, they'll have to go through that period where they learn on the jobs. That's how it's done in construction. Unlike Germany, where you could go to schools for that, we don't have that kind of educational infrastructure in the U.S. But as salaries increase, I think there will be more people entering the construction trades, and as they work in those trades and gain more experience, that will increase the skill level. But that will take an enormous amount of time. It gets back to what Ramon was reporting, the fact that we lost a lot of jobs. We lost a lot of people who haven't come back in the labor force. Some of that is because of COVID relief payments and all that legislation where the payments have been high enough where people have not had the economic need to go back on the job. That's going to be diminishing over time. That is that kind of welfare. And as that happens, there will be greater demand to go back and re-enter the labor force and enter where jobs have the highest wage rates. Construction already has a higher than average wage rate, but I think it will increase faster than the rest of the nation simply because the demand is there.
I mean, the main incentive to attract workers to one industry compared to another is how fast the salaries and wages are increasing in that industry compared to other industries. So if you want to attract more people in the construction, wages there have to increase at a faster rate compared to the others, as Jim said. A great example is the trucking. With all the shortages of drivers in the last several months, now the schools where they learn how to drive trucks, they have a very high demand and by people who want to learn. Why? Because they are paying very high salaries, $80,000 or more. So it's attracting more people to those schools, and eventually, they'll join the industry.
But I certainly encourage entrepreneurs out there. I'm a little bit too old. I'll stick to running marathons with my old codgers. But for other young, rising entrepreneurs out there, I think a great market would be training facilities for construction workers. To have schools in this area, I think the demand will be very high. And people that I know, like Ron Simon, a great entrepreneur here in Orange County, he's actually thinking along those lines. So let's keep our fingers crossed. With the next question, with the recession probable in 2023, well, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that may be a good year. Could be even 2024 because of the long delay before a monetary tightening actually has an impact on GDP. And there's so much delayed fiscal spending that's still this dry powder in the economy that will keep the economy going. But nonetheless, with the imminent recession, are there any events that may delay and warning signs that it's imminent? Yeah, I think you have to look at what the Federal Reserve Board is going to be doing, and the stubbornness, the stickiness, the persistence of inflation. If, let's say, it turns out that Jerome Powell, in his initial call, that this inflation was going to be transitory because of the globally competitive economy, and that's what changes the new economy from what we used to have in the 20th century. Maybe inflation will come down more rapidly. Remember, our forecast is for inflation to be in the 6 to 7% range for the rest of the year. If it were to drop back to 5, 4, 3 quickly, and the Federal Reserve Board puts a halt on further increases in the federal funds rate, then that will mean that our call of recession will be unjustified. But what are some of the signs that we are correct and that it is occurring? The Federal Reserve Board continuing to increase interest rates, inflation staying persistent. Because remember, it's the persistence of inflation that explains recessions. The Fed has to keep raising interest rates until it can bring prices down. If prices remain stubbornly high and the interest rates go from 0.2 to 0.6 to 1% to 1.5%, 2%, then the chances of a recession build.
Yeah, it's not going to be the fiscal measures, because there is no real support in Congress to go back to the deficits that we had in 2020 and 2021, as Jim showed in one of his slides. So it is all going to be on the monetary side, as Jim explained.
The question here is, can there be comments about stock market given strong GDP but a looming recession? So if we're correct about a recession, what does that mean about a stock market? Well, we've had maybe 8 recessions since 1960, and 6 of those recessions there's been a bear market. The market adjusts. The market isn't responding to GDP. The market is very simple. When you invest in a share of stock, what you're getting is a piece of the profit action. It's basically the profitability of companies. That's your return. You either get it in the form of dividends, or the company reinvests those profits into the business, and that means the capital value of the business increases. So the most important key measure that adds to a bull market is rising profitability, per share returns. A recession, lower spending, GDP dropping, what that means is that consumers comprise roughly two-thirds of overall gross county product. If their spending decreases, that will reduce profitability, and when profitability begins to decline, so too does the market. The market anticipates that. They're going to be looking to forward earnings and to seeing, can they anticipate this drop in profitability? Right now, profits are like at an all-time high. So the key is watch profitability, look at projections on profitability, and what I like to look at, which is the earnings price ratio. You all know what the PE ratio is, price of a stock versus earnings. Take the flip of that reciprocal and look at earnings divided by prices, because that ratio, which is now around 3.5%, that means on average, if you invest in a stock, you get a 3.5% return on your money. If that begins to drop and long-term rates begin to increase, watch out. I think we have time for one question. And one more question, and then we will conclude. And that is, for a small to medium-sized contractor in the construction industry, what's your best advice for 2022? While you're thinking,
I think you know the market is still going to be good in the construction industry in 2022. So if permits are going to slow a little bit at the end of the year, and home prices also, but in general for the year, the construction industry will be doing fine in the Inland Empire in particular.
My caveat there is, my best advice would be, if the construction is heavily in AAA commercial space, office space, to migrate from that to industrial and warehousing, and move away from commercial office space, because I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what this revolution in virtual working is going to do to the demand for commercial space. And when I say the tip of the iceberg now is the giveaways, the freebies that developers or property owners are giving. But I think within the next year is going to be significantly lower lease rates, vacancies, a surplus of space, and lower construction. See if you can migrate away from that.
Residential, yeah.
With that depressing news, I guess we're going to be concluding our forecast and have my good friend and my former student, who I'm very proud of, Rick Muth, take the stage. Rick, thank you again for all you've done and making the 30th forecast possible. Wow.
Well, thank you.
I never thought 30 years ago we would be here, and you're looking as young and spry as you were 30 years ago.
I don't know if he's telling the truth about that, but hey, this has been great, and both of you were outstanding today, just outstanding. Oh, by the way, did you get the question, in case somebody wants to know the first step if they want to give their kidney? Did you get that question by any chance? I think
it was one of. Thank you for mentioning that, and I would like to encourage people. There are 100,000 people waiting for kidneys. There are young people whose lives are threatened because of their kidney disease. You can save a life. You don't have to go to war, some stupid war, to save someone's life. You can give a kidney. And now it's been 3 years. I feel fine. I'm still running marathons, so there's no loss. We don't need 2 kidneys. And if you could give one, you save a life. So thank you for allowing me to make that pitch. You can save a young person's life out there, and certainly improve the quality of that person's life.
Well, I thought that the audience would love to hear that, and thank you for your beautiful response. And also, I'd like the three of us say, great job, Orange County Production Studios. You guys were wonderful, and I've checked with people that are online. They said it's really good. And the last thing I'd like to say is to our audience, I hope, first of all, thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I also hope that this is of great help to you, that you can use this information, something about your life, your business, your decisions. And one more thing, see you in 2023?
Number 31.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.